Well, good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. As I'm sure a lot of you saw on Facebook, that I won the AHL championship. My team, not personally, like I wasn't the only one on the team. It was a team effort. In fact, if you ask most of the other team, it was probably more of a team effort than my effort. But my name will be on here now 4 times in a row. And I'm super excited. Some of you may recognize what the bottom half of this is. And you're wondering why I brought it to church today. And that's some of you who don't recognize what the bottom half of this is, then you're going to heaven, and that's really exciting. So anyway, I'm excited. And actually, one of my buddies that I play hockey with is here today this morning, and so he lost. And I'm just pointing that out. And also, I'm pointing out that I don't want to point him out, like make it obvious, because, like it's awkward when you're first time in church and they make you stand or ask you questions or something like that. We won't do that. But if you talk to him, it'll be obvious he's Canadian and he has a way thicker accent than I do. So anyway, so this will sit here kind of just to be a part today of the message and whatever. But how many have, let me ask you this, how many have a room in your house that looks like this? Anybody have a room in their house that looks like that? How many have multiple rooms maybe in your house that look like this? And you have this is what it's like, and let me ask you, and you don't mind it looking like this? Is there anybody you don't mind the mess? It's okay with you that it looks like this? Like you're creative, you have a creative personality. You like if somebody were to come in and clean your house, then you wouldn't know how to find anything in your house, right? Like you wouldn't know where things are put. You wouldn't know what to do if it looked clean. Now, how many have a house or a room in their house that looks more like this? Now, I know some of you. Now, those of you who raised your hand the first time, you're probably thinking, nobody lives here. What is wrong with these people? And they need to get more stuff. Like, it's a home. You should live in your home, and it should look like you live in your home, okay? And so, but anyway, my name is Nathan. I'm the lead pastor here at Ridgeline, and I'm so excited to be with you this morning as we continue part 2 of the series that we've been in called A Breath of Fresh Air. And I just want to last week, if you were here for Mother's Day, wasn't it awesome out in the lobby? Didn't our First Impressions team just do an absolutely awesome job last week? They went above and beyond. Josh and Jillian are our First Impressions team leaders, and they went above and beyond last week. There were balloons. They were taking pictures of families. They coordinated a whole bunch of awesome extra stuff for Mother's Day, and it was really, really awesome, and I'm super proud of them. Now, if you're interested in getting on a team, like you love to greet people, you like to hang out, you're a people person, maybe you're a musician or a singer, or maybe you like to work behind the scenes, you'd love to help with how we get all of this set up or how we get all of this tore down every week, or you want to pull one of our trailers because we're portable. We bring all this stuff in every week and we tear it down every week and we put it back in the trailer and all that. If you're interested in any of those things, and like Bessie said just a few minutes ago, we have Starting Point, which is the first step is a meet and greet with my wife and I right after service in one of these rooms back over here. We'll have some refreshments for you. We'll hang out. We'll get to know you a little bit better, and we'll just hear your story and spend some time together. So that'll be right after the service. But before I move on with today's talk, I got to let you know a little bit of sad news that just kind of broke my heart this week. And just so we know as a church that this week, as I highlighted Josh and Jillian earlier, this Thursday night or into Friday morning, Jillian's mother passed away after a 10-year battle with dealing with some issues with her heart because of some chemotherapy that because of some cancer, 10 years prior, and she passed away this week. And so if you think about it, they would love your support, and they would love for you to be around and love them and hang out with them and just encourage them and all of that. And also, there is a memorial service this coming Saturday in Pisgah Forest Baptist Church, and that's where she went to church, and so that's where we're going to be honoring her life. Her pastor will be speaking, and I'll be speaking, and there'll be lots of music, and it will be a great time of both mourning and celebration, because we know ultimately where she is spending eternity, and we are grateful for that. So anyway, but as I said, we've been in this series called The Breath of Fresh Air. And we've been talking about, do you have the time to really, we've been talking about it's okay that if a room in your house looks like this, or it's okay if a couple of the rooms in your house looks like this, but it's not okay if your life looks like this, and it's not okay if your schedule looks like this, or your finances look like this, or your relationships look like this. That's not a good thing, right? That's not a good place to be in. It's okay. It's one thing to have a room in your house like this, but it's another thing for your checkbook or your finances to kind of feel like this or to look like this, and you end up in a point where you don't have any margin, or you don't have any breathing room, or you don't have the ability to stop and take a breath of fresh air. And last week, we defined what breathing room is, and here's what we define. Breathing room is the space between our current pace and our limits. And we learned last week that each of us have limits. Your limits may be incredible. You may have an incredible capacity, but at some point you know that you have a limit. And your breathing room, your margin, is the distance between your limits and your pace. And for some of us, our pace is right up against our limits. And we all have limits. And when there's no space between our margin and our limits, we have no room to breathe, and we have no room to stop and take a breath air. So today, I want to talk to you specifically about your schedule. Now, my tendency and your tendency as people is to cram everything in as much as we can when it comes to the area of our schedule. And we try to do everything, and what we end up doing is we don't enjoy life, because we end up doing so much, because this is what our schedule looks like, and we don't end up enjoying life. And we rearrange sometimes we rearrange the schedule, but we never ever take anything out of the schedule. And we can't figure out why the schedule still never works for us, or why we're never any better off, and because all we've done is rearrange the mess, and we're never really removed any of the mess. And here's how you know when it comes to your schedule that you have a problem, and that you look like this. Here's how you know. If you say, maybe a couple times a week or more, I'll be there, but I'll be about 15 minutes late. Okay, some of you are laughing because you know exactly what you say this, okay? If you say that, I'll be there, but I'll be, if you say on a regular basis, I'll be there, but I might have to leave a few minutes early. Or, don't worry, and this happened to me this week, and I was so embarrassed. I'll be at your play, dear, but what act or what scene are you on? Because I might be a little late, and then after you're done, I might have to leave a little early. But I'm going to be there for your part. Don't worry, dear. I'm not going to miss your part, okay? Or you might know you're in trouble when you constantly drive fast all the time because you don't want to be late. You know that if you don't drive fast, you're going to be late. Or if you always are eating in your car, if your life just feels like go, 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 if you're at work constantly thinking about all the things you need to do at home, or you're at home thinking about all the things that you need to be doing at work, these are signs that you may have a problem like this in your schedule. And you got your kids going to all kinds of different things, all kinds of different events, or maybe you're single and you haven't learned how to say no, and so you get suckered into going to everything, and then it's the day of, and you're like, why did I agree to go to this? I didn't even want to go to this event, and you're too afraid to take it back, and life is just crammed full of stuff. And so today we're going to talk about how to solve and how to address this when it comes to our schedule. And if this is you, and you're here this morning or you're watching online, then we're going to learn how to deal. We're going to learn how to deal with this. If this is where you're at. Now, if this is not where you're at, and your schedule feels pretty good, or you feel like you have some margin, then the principles in today's talk are going to help you stay that way. And so today we're going to get this great pearl of wisdom out of the book of Psalms. And Psalms number 90, which was written by Moses, which of all people, normally when we think of the book of Psalms, we think of David, King David, the David and Goliath David, that guy, and he wrote a lot of the Psalms. He was a great songwriter, and usually we think about David, but this one, Psalm 90, was actually written by Moses, okay? And let me tell you why you need to pay attention to what Moses has to say about time. Is because the Bible says that Moses lived to be 120 years old. Now, that's really old. Now, some of you are sitting by someone, you're not old yourself, but you're sitting by someone who's really old in your opinion. But this is really, really old. Moses lived to be, and the Bible makes this note, or the side note, at one point in Scripture, it says that his eyesight was really good. And in a couple of minutes, when I ask you to open your Bible, some of you are going to be like doing like this, and you're nowhere near 120 years old, or just for you to see the screen a minute ago, or what's been on the screen, you've had to put on glasses. And so the Bible makes this note that he lived to be 120 years old, and that his eyesight was really well, which is a really random thing to put in the Bible, in my opinion. But Moses lived throughout his 120 years 4 very different seasons of life. And in fact, if you know the story of Moses, you know that immediately his mom gave him up for adoption, and he was sent down a river in a basket, and he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, the ruler of Egypt. And so he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was the grandson of the king. Even though he was a Hebrew or a Jewish person, and all of the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, he missed out on having to grow up as a slave like the rest of the Israelites, and he grows up in the palace as the king's son. And of course, he's got it made in the palace. There are plasma TVs everywhere. He's got chariots like you wouldn't believe. I mean, it's just a wonderful, and he has this great upbringing. He has this very wealthy life, even though the rest of his native people are enslaved to the very persons whose house he is living in. And then eventually he has a falling out with his family, and he murders an Egyptian. And so now he's in trouble, right? He's living as an Israelite in Egypt, and he murders an Egyptian, and they throw him out. And so the second stage of his life is the next 40 years, he becomes a shepherd, and he watches sheep. And he doesn't have his own sheep. He doesn't have anything. He's watching his father-in-law's sheep. He's watching somebody else's sheep, which means at this age in your life, you've probably not been very successful if you have to watch somebody else's sheep. And of course, watching sheep is incredibly tedious, and he does this for 4 years. You get up, you bring the sheep out of the pen, you let them graze all day long, you sit there, you watch the sheep. Once in a while, you prevent them from another animal trying to prey on them, and then you put them back in the pen at night, and he does this over and over and over again for 40 years. And the best that he could ever hope for at this stage in his life is that he has a few kids, and that he dies, and that his grandkids remember his name. And then he goes into the next part of his life. And it's crazy how he ends up getting there, but he goes into the next part of his life, and God speaks to him, and God speaks to him through a burning bush, and so there's a bush that appears to be on fire, and God begins to talk out of the bush, and can you imagine being the first person that Moses tells this story to? Like, hey, God spoke to me through a burning bush. And I would be like, Moses, we're pretty sure you've been burning a little bush yourself, right? So he speaks, and so he says, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him to let my people go. And so, of course, he goes to Pharaoh, his grandfather. And he says, God told me to, and Moses stutters, so he's not even like a great communicator. Can you imagine being intimidated? You have to go to Pharaoh, the king, and say, will you let God's people? And of course, Pharaoh says no. And then we see the 10 plagues, the frogs and the blood in the water and the moon turns to blood. And there's the crickets and there's all the different plagues that go on. And eventually Pharaoh says yes. And he lets the Israelites go free of slavery. And then we move into part 4 of Moses' life. And in part 4 of Moses' life, he now is the leader of a nation. The nation of Israel, as they are leaving Egypt. And of course, they've been in slavery for the last 400 years as a nation, and they don't know how to live as free people. And we talked a lot about this last week. And if you didn't see last week's message, or if you weren't here, you can get caught up online, ridgelineasheville.com/watch. You can go make sure you get caught up because we talked more specifically about this story, about them leaving Egypt. But he now is leading this entire nation. He didn't choose this. This is just the way that his life worked out. And he leads this nation. Of course, they don't know how to be free. Because for generations and generations they've been slaves. And so now that they're free, they begin to whine and complain because, it's a lot different lifestyle. And God gets really frustrated with them. And he's trying to, get them out of Egypt and into the promised land. But they're whining so much that God says, I'm going to let this generation of whiners die off before I allow them to go into the promised land. And so now Moses has to spend the next 40 years of his life circling in the desert, like he doesn't know where he's going. And he's going around and around and around in the desert until this last generation of slaves dies off. And then he ends up, the end of his life, he gets to the promised land and he's led this whole nation to the land. And God says to Moses, you can't go in. You're not allowed in. But I hear you have really great eyesight. So I'm going to let you go up on a mountain and look in. And that's how Moses spends his life. He spends his whole life waiting for God's promise of the Israelites to be free and God's promise of the promised land, and then he never gets to enter that land. And this is someone with some perspective on life and on time. And in the 90th Psalm, Moses shares with us by song, in this little snapshot of the Old Testament. They didn't have Snapchat back then. This snapshot of the Old Testament, he shares with us insight about time that I find completely astounding and I find completely stunning, and just something that creates such context for the way that we live and spend our time and live our lives. And what he shares is the context for every decision that you and I make as it relates to what we do with our schedule and how we spend our time. And so now Psalm 90, of course, it was written, Moses wrote the song and it was written in the Hebrew language. And specifically this song is tricky to translate into English. But at the end of this psalm, or towards the end of the verses we're going to be looking at today in this song, there is a powerful punchline that I want to share with you. And so we're going to pick it up at Psalm 90. We're going to start in the very beginning at the top at verse 1. So here we go. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. This is the way he begins the song. Okay, Moses is saying, God, you have been our dwelling place, referring to the Israelites, the Jewish people. You have been our dwelling place. In other words, we have lived in the context of who you are throughout all of our generations so far. And then he continues in verse 2, and this is what he says. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world before the mountains were born. I love that. Isn't that great imagery? Isn't that really nice? Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world. See, Moses was a creationist. He believed that God created. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And see, somewhere in the middle, I love the way that he explains God. He says, from everlasting to everlasting. It's like you ever been at a sign that has arrows pointing in two different directions? It's like from everlasting to everlasting. That's your God. Okay, now me, I'm Moses, and if we pause everlasting to everlasting, I'm somewhere here, kind of in the middle. Just at my time, at my life, the nation of Israel. I'm here for the amount of time that I'm here. But you're bigger. You live outside it. Like I have linear time, but you're everlasting to everlasting. And verse 3 continues. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. Now, this seems like a strange thing to put in a song. Unless it's like a metal song. I don't know. This could be, maybe he played in a metal band. I don't know. This could have been his rebellious teenage years. I'm not sure exactly when he wrote the song. But this seems like a weird thing to put. And this may seem even offensive to us in our kind of modern way of thinking, especially the way that we think about God, but not to Moses. See, this is his way of saying God controls the beginning and the ends. God controls the beginnings and the ends, and he controls and has input into the day-to-day of our lives. Now, theologically, we struggle with this sometimes. I mean, all of us have probably had the thought of, like, does God kill people? Right? Or does God cause bad things to happen to people? Now, personally, I don't believe that either of those things are true, but we ask those questions, or maybe is it for maybe God doesn't kill people, or he doesn't just allow bad things to happen to people, or is it just that does he just kind of know how long we're going to live? Or does he decide how long we have to live? How many days we're going to live? And you know what? I don't know. But here's what's important in this. For most of us, whether we recognize it or not, or whether we can explain it or not, and most of us think that God has something to do with the length of our lives. And I can prove it. If you were to find out today or tomorrow, you go to the doctor for a checkup tomorrow, a physical, and you would find out that you're terminally ill. Or you find out tomorrow that someone close to you that you know and you love and you do life with is terminally ill. Some of you may have never said a prayer in your life, or you haven't said a prayer since you were Catholic as a kid, or you haven't said, but you would say, most of us would say a prayer. And it may just be as simple as, oh God, what are we going to do? And it may not be any longer than that. That may be the entire prayer, but there is something in us that believes that God has something to do with the number of days that we live. And I don't know why. I can't explain that. But Moses continues in verse 4, and here's what he says. He says, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Now, Moses is referring to a military watch. And in this time, in this context, in history, it would have been a 3 to 4 hour shift. And Moses is saying, like, you know how we as humans, as we get older, maybe you've heard your grandparents say, or your parents say, especially if you're younger, or maybe you're getting to that point in your life where you begin to realize it's like, man, life this past year just really seemed to fly by. Right? This past year just seemed to really go quick. And imagine if we feel that way. Imagine how Moses is saying, imagine how God feels when his context for time isn't just linear, it's from everlasting to everlasting. Imagine what my life must feel like to him. How fast does my life fly by to you, God? And for you, the God of everlasting to everlasting, how does my life look? And my life is such a big deal to me. It's all that I know. But what is it to you? How does it look to you when 1,000 years is like a military night watch shift? So we continue verses 5 and 6. This is what they say. Eventually, this is what here we go. You sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. And in the morning, it springs up new. But by evening, it is dry and withered. People, you and me, we're born. We have our whole lives ahead of us. And it feels like we have, everything to live for. But yet Moses makes this contrast that compared to the way that God sees our lives, it's like a piece of grass that comes up in the morning and the heat of the day. By the end of the day, the heat of the day withers it and it dies. And that's the perspective that Moses thinks that God has about our lives. And God, I guess from your perspective, our lives and what we worry about so much when it comes to our schedule and our time, I mean, what is that to you? Now, isn't this just like the most encouraging and exciting message you've ever heard? Like, aren't you so stoked you came to church today or you're watching online? Like, isn't this just great? This is just super like, yeah. You're going to leave shouting, right? No. No. But let's jump down to verse 10 because there's something here that I want you to see. Verse 10, it says this: our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. And Moses says that, look, even my greatest years, the prime of my life, I spent 40 of them watching these stupid sheep day after day. The best of our years are trouble and sorrow. And Moses, he has to deal with at different times of his life, 40 years watching sheep, then 40 years wandering a desert. And whatever you came whining about this morning, I'm pretty sure Moses beats you in the whining, department. But so, okay, Moses, this is a bit of a downer. So can you get to the point? But Moses is saying, here's what he's saying. Don't lose faith because you're dwarfed by God's magnitude. Don't lose faith because you're dwarfed by God's magnitude or the brevity of your life. Don't lose faith because of a God who's from everlasting to everlasting, or your own life that is just a snapshot when it comes to the way that God sees time. Don't lose faith over that. And here's the rest of verse 10 that I love. And it says, go back one, sorry. That was my fault. There we go. For they quickly pass and we fly away. All the sorrow, all the trouble, it quickly passes. Now, how many remember as a kid, you grew up in church and maybe in Sunday school, you sang that song, "I'll fly away, oh glory." Psalm 80. Moses wrote the first part of that. Now, I don't remember the hymnal, giving him proper credit, but, anyway, that was his lyrics. That's where this comes from. And this is what Moses is saying. And then we get to verse 11, and this is the confusing one. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Now, I think Moses was burning the bush again when he wrote this lyric of this song. And the point of translators, right? Like people translate the Bible, and we spend a lot of time trying to translate. When we go back to when a Bible is translated into English, we go back to the original text, and we go back to. And sometimes it's hard to come up with the right English terms or the right words or the right whatever. So instead of kind of breaking this down and going back into the original text and trying to re-explain it to you word by word what Moses is trying to communicate, let me offer some alternative statements to help you put this in context. And I think that probably when it comes to translations, this is one of the best. I'm not saying that there's a fault in this translation. I just think that our comprehension of it sometimes without knowing the original language can affect the way that we see and interpret Scripture. And so here's a statement. That if we could see God as he is, we would give him the reverence he is due. And Moses is saying, you, God, you're everlasting to everlasting, and I'm like a piece of grass that grows in the morning, and then by the afternoon, the heat of the day, by the evening is withered away. I'm here today and gone tomorrow. My life is like boom, 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 and then it's over with, and I'm going like fast, but I think it's super fast. But to you, how crazy fast must my life be going by to you? And Moses pauses. What I find interesting about this song and what Moses is doing here in the writing of this song is he pauses in this big grand explanation of how he feels about his life and time and all of this. And he says, wow, if we could somehow see God as he is, then when it comes to our time and our lives, we would give him the reverence that he is due. And because I only have this tiny, tiny, tiny slice of history, of time to do something with, wouldn't the rational or the logical thing for me to do be to somehow, in my blip of existence, to bring God the most glory that I could bring him? Here's another way to say verse 11. Here's another way we could say this. If we could see God as he is, then we would be more careful with the time that we have been allotted. If we could see God as he is, then we would be more careful. See, if we could see God as who he is and realize that he gave us life and he gave us time and he's everlasting to everlasting, but we're here today and gone tomorrow like the grass. If we could have that perspective, if that was the perspective that we would have, then we probably would rethink what we do with the gift of limited time that we've been given. And we don't think like this, though, do we? See, it takes Moses to kind of push back against our natural train of thought, to bring proper context into our lives. And we think the context of my life is my life, like I have the whole thing. And Moses says, no, the context of your life is everlasting to everlasting. And it is good to pause every once in a while and to stop and to take a breath of fresh air and contemplate the brevity of life. And in doing so, you will indirectly and eventually directly impact what you decide to do with your time. Now watch this. He continues in verse 12, and this is what Moses writes in this song. He says, teach us to number our days. Teach us. And I love that he says teach us, because that's something we wouldn't naturally do. But he says, but because we don't do this naturally, because this isn't something that comes to us normally, it's not a habit we all have, teach us to live as if our days are numbered. That's what Moses is saying. Because it's not natural. We live as if we're going to live forever. That we spend our time as if it's always going to be there. We treat our kids as if they're always going to be around. We treat our spouse as if they're always going to be there. Our careers as if they're always going to be there. Our parents as if they're always going to be there. And as if it's unlimited. As if the time that we have on earth is unlimited. And we know that it's not, but in terms of our schedule and the way that we try to cram everything in and the way that we prioritize, we live as if our days are not numbered. And Moses says, no, don't do that. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. You need to learn to number them. You need to learn to live as if your days are numbered. And we've done this before in areas of our life. If you're a lady here and you've ever been engaged or you've been married or you are married and you learn to number your days from the time that your boyfriend got down on his knee and he said, will you marry me? And then you said yes and you picked a date and you numbered your days. You knew how many days until your wedding and you knew how to plan out everything and you made this has to be done on this day. And we got to fit everybody and we got to ask people and we got to get the invites out and we knew, we numbered those days. Those days were numbered. Same thing if you're in school and your professor, your teacher, maybe you're in high school or you're in college, your professor tells you your final exam is in 1 week. You number your days. You say, I got 7 days to study. Now some of you will still leave it to the last night, but you number your days. And you say, you know what, I got to put my study guide together, and then I got to get a study group, and then I've got to get some personal study time, and we do this. And this is how we're familiar with the concept. But when it comes to the overall way that we live our lives. But Moses says, but what if we lived our entire lives this way? Not just from time to time, but what if we lived our whole lives just like this? And then he goes on. He says, why would you live like this? Why would we make the effort to live this way? And he continues verse 12. This is what he says. He says that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Moses says the reason why he says teach us to number our days is that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to live as if our days are numbered, because in living as if our days are numbered, we will gain wisdom. Wisdom in what? In what we should put into our schedule, in what we should take out of our schedule, and how we should prioritize our time, what our time should look like. But if we live as if you live as if your days are not numbered, then you will continue to fill your days with things that later you will wish you had not filled your days with. But when you begin to number your days, you immediately gain a healthy perspective. And that says, I can't waste my time with that. Or I can't waste my time on this. Or I need to spend more time doing these things. And I need to spend no time doing these things. And I need to begin to spend some time doing something else. And this is how we spend our time. So let me summarize everything that we've learned before we move on. We're getting towards the end here. I only got another hour and a half, and then we'll be out, okay? But let me summarize everything before we move on. Here is what Moses is saying. Here's what he's saying. Remembering our time is limited provides us with wisdom to know how to spend our limited time. Remembering our time is limited provides us with the wisdom to know how to spend our limited time. That's what Moses is trying to communicate. And I'm going to do you a huge favor this morning. Here's what I want to do for the next couple minutes as we kind of wrap up. I'm going to do you a huge favor. I'm going to fast forward with you to the end of your life. And you are about to instantaneously gain the wisdom that Moses had at the end of his life, that oftentimes we don't have the proper perspective of, or that we don't have the opportunity to gain until it becomes, until we get to the end of our own lives. And if you will take this wisdom and bring it into your current stage of life, you will make better decisions as it relates to what you put into your time and what you put into your schedule, which is the same as what you put into your life. And so there's this lady, and her name is Bronnie Ware. And she lives in Australia, and she's a hospice nurse. And she spends most of her time with people in the last 12 weeks of their lives. And she says, and she stays with them all the way through to the end of their life until it is completely over. And some time ago, she began to ask these people a series of questions. And in the book, and eventually she collected enough data, she wrote a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. And she writes that at the end of their lives, she asks them, do you have any regrets? And she began to hear a pattern. She begins to hear a pattern. So let's fast forward to the end of our lives and get a perspective that we wouldn't probably have the ability to get any other way. And I want to share with you the top 2 regrets that people have within the last 12 weeks, or for maybe in most cases the last few days, the last few hours of their life. And the second one, we'll start at number 2. You probably will have guessed, and you probably will have guessed that this one is number 1, but it's not. It's the second one. And so here it is. Here's number 2. Here's the regret. It's this, is that I wish I hadn't worked so hard. There's nothing new there, right? I mean, we probably all guessed this one. I wish I'd not been at work so much. I wish I'd spent more time with my wife. I wish I'd spent more time with my family. I wish I'd spent more time with my kids. I wish I would have spent more time doing other things. And here's what she says about this regret or this insight from her book. Here's a quote from her book, and I got to read it from the screen here. This came from every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Women also spoke of this regret, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been the breadwinners. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much time of their lives on the treadmill of the work existence. And there you have it. Don't you know what this means, guys, men, women? That if you don't learn to number your days, we will misspend our time and our lives, and we will have avoidable regrets at the end of our lives. Because when you think that we have all the time in the world when it comes to your kids or your spouse, and then suddenly you realize that you don't have all the time in the world, you can't go back. And you know what? You can only be in your 20s once, and you can only be in your 30s once, and you can only be in your 40s a couple times, right, Miss Debbie? And you can only be a certain age one time. And here's why it's so important that these men and women who are numbering their days because they can't avoid it any longer,